time. Should we go ahead and start? I'm going to click the mute all button, which won't mute everyone, but it'll mute people. I don't think it will. Well, we'll find out. Oh, it will. All right, hang on. All right. Good morning, everyone. Today is October 4th, 2020. This is the Faith and Function class. Our teacher today is Dr. Steve McKenzie. We have a 2-week series on how to read the Bible with historical and apocalyptic literature. I don't know which one is today. It will be a surprise that will be exciting for everyone. So we are being recorded. This will show up on Idlewild's YouTube page in a few days. Thanks everybody for coming. Are there any announcements? You're all on mute, so you might have to wave or unmute yourself if you have an announcement. Or we have the chat. All right. Are there any joys or concerns? All right. I have not prepared, but I guess I will start with a brief prayer. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this beautiful day today and the chance to come together and study your word. Please speak to us through these ancient texts and give us some wisdom for our lives today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, Dr. McKenzie, you may proceed.
Okay, well, good morning. It's good to see you all again. And as before, I'm happy for you just to jump in at any point with questions, comments. When I go to the PowerPoint, I won't be able to see everyone, so you may just have to unmute and speak up or something like that. But please feel comfortable, feel free to do that. And we should have some time at the end for questions, comments, and so on, assuming that I time it right. So we'll see. So we are talking today about history. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? I'm going to assume you all can.
Yes.
Okay, good. So our topic for today, as Daniel mentioned, we'll be talking for the next 2 Sundays about two different kinds of literature in the Bible. What we'll be talking about today is focused on the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And the issue is that of history or history writing. The background of this series of these 2 Sundays, just to give you sort of where they came from, is that when I was contacted about teaching in the class, one of the things that was mentioned was a book that I had written some time ago entitled How to Read the Bible, which I'm holding up so you may be able to see the cover. If you can't, don't worry about it. But the point of that book was to look at different types of literature within the Bible itself. We often talk about the Bible as a book, but in fact, pardon me, it is not a book, it is a library. It is a collection of different types of literature, different writings over a long period of time. So we are looking at different kinds of literature. Today we'll talk a little bit about history writing, and next week we'll talk about apocalyptic literature. So the key word, I guess, in terms of the background is this term genre, which is actually a French word that means type or class or category. We're used to using this word for all kinds of different things, for books. When you go into a library or into a bookstore or online, you might find divisions of the materials by fiction, nonfiction. And if you've been, for example, recently, or if you can remember going to the I get it mixed up which one now is the bookstore and which one's the cafe, Libro or Novel, but the old Davis Kid, I think most of you know what I'm talking about. You go in and you would see lots of different signs, and there might be mysteries, there might be Westerns, there might be horror, and so on, self-help. And each of those is a type, a genre. Same with music. You have classical, you have rock, you have country western, hip hop, and so on. And movies, films, paintings, anyway. You get the point. So there are different types of literature, different kinds. And the Bible also has different kinds of literature. And the reason why this is important is because we make, as readers, we bring assumptions to the different types of literature. When we pick up a newspaper in the morning, for example, if you do that, or read online from a news source, you don't read that material the same way as you would if you were picking up a novel or reading a work of fiction or a textbook, or some other kind of literature. We already, coming in as readers, make assumptions about what we expect to find. And that influences the way that we read and the way that we understand that material. If you try to read a news story as though it were fiction, you would have a misunderstanding of that literature. Or if you tried to read a novel as though it were a journalistic report, again, you would have a misunderstanding. There are some good examples, in fact, of exactly that sort of thing happening. Some of you may remember, well, probably not, but you may remember at least your parents or your grandparents talking about this event that happened 82 years ago this month, in which Orson Welles, some of you will know who that is or was, Orson Welles, a well-known celebrity, actor, so on, put on a radio play in 1938 in October 30th. And it was a radio enactment of the novel by H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds. Now, when the program began, there was an announcement at the beginning that said this is a radio theater. But if you happen to miss that, as many people did, or just weren't paying very close attention, the next thing that you might have heard was that that Earth was being invaded by Martians. Attention to the beginning and thought that they were hearing a news broadcast rather than a fictional report or story. So that caused a panic across the country. And the newspapers the next day were filled with stories like this one, like this headline from the what was at that point the Boston Daily Globe, now the Boston Globe, about this radio play terrifying the nation. And there were meetings in Congress and uh, laws passed to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. But what it was at heart, basically, was a confusion of genre, a misunderstanding of the type of broadcast that was being heard. More recently, some of you might be familiar with this movie. And if you're not, maybe your children or grandchildren are. You can ask them about it. This movie called Galaxy Quest, which was released in 1999, had some pretty well-known actors in it. You can see sort of three main ones there on the screen: Tim Allen, Sigourney Weaver, and Alan Rickman. And there were others: Tony Shalhoub, if you know who that is, and Sam Rockwell. They were also in it. Rainn Wilson, who was on The Office, you might be familiar with, who played Dwight. Anyway, that was they were all members of this cast. And the premise of the movie was that these people like the Tim Allen, Sigourney Weaver, Alan Rickman were television stars. They were stars of a program called Galaxy Quest that was kind of like Star Trek. It was science fiction, but there were aliens, people from or beings from another planet, who were tuning into this broadcast and misunderstood the genre, the type of literature or type of content of the broadcast, and thought that they were hearing not a fictional program, but that they were hearing the real heroic deeds of actual figures, of actual people. And so they, the plot goes that they had a crisis on their planet. They were being attacked, invaded. And so they came to Earth to seek the help of the heroes from this ship, Galaxy Quest, or this show, Galaxy Quest. So again, the movie didn't do particularly well on the big screen, but it has since become kind of a cult favorite. And there are conventions of people who are big fans who get together and talk about the movie and relive it and so on, just like they do with Star Trek. But at any rate, again, the kind of the premise of the show, of the movie, was a misunderstanding of genre, of the type of program that these aliens were tuning into. All right, so that's just a couple of examples of confusion of genre. In one case, panic, actual panic in the streets in 1938. In the other case, a humorous presentation, but you get the point. And the importance of kind of understanding what type of literature or what type of program or what type of music or whatever that you're involved with. So when it comes to the Bible, again, we're not looking at an individual or a single book by a single author. We're looking at a collection of literature, a library. And there are within the biblical literature itself different words for different types of literature. We're pretty accustomed for people who are Bible readers, who are familiar with the Bible material, we're pretty accustomed to these different genres, these different words, these different types of literature, and don't really pay them much attention, although they do influence the way that we read the stories. There is a word, for example, especially in the New Testament, for parable. You find it also in the Old Testament, and it's the same word for proverb. So the point of this type of literature would be to teach a lesson of some kind. And when you read something like the parable of the good sower in the New Testament, you don't read it as though this actually happened. I mean, it could have, but that's not really the way you read it. You understand it as a parable. And one of the things you do is kind of start looking for the lesson. There's a word, there are several of them actually, for prophecy. And one of them means an oracle or a burden, something that the prophet, the individual, is compelled to divest themselves of, to release. There's a word for song. And one of the things that happens in English translations of the Bible is that the translators put songs or poetry in verse form in our translations in order to try to help us. In the ancient manuscripts, they aren't in verse form. And because they're in verse form, because we encounter it that way, we already read such works somewhat differently. There's a word for instruction. We often translate it law, but actually a better translation is instruction. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are the books of the law, or better, books of instruction, teaching. And again, we read that differently than we would something that is parable. There are long lists of names that the Bible has a word for genealogy that we know. Those are the places we always skip, as readers, because who wants to read a bunch of names? They're fascinating in their own right, and just as with other genres, it's important to understand what's really going on there, because they're actually more. They function as more than just lists. But that's a topic for another day. One of the things you'll notice, though, in this list of Bible words for genres is there is no word for history. There is, in fact, no word for history in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. For one thing, it's a Greek word. That's where the word comes from. And so in those books of the Bible that are often referred to as historical books, that's not a name that they use for themselves. That's a name that's kind of put upon them, and it influences the way that we read them. But it is a complicated idea and a complicated term, and that's what we're going to focus on today. What lies behind this idea of history? Now, there's an awful lot of literature in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that kind of falls into that category. And we won't be able to cover it all, so I'm going to focus on a few passages, and mostly from the book of Genesis early on. We'd have to maybe make some adjustments for other kinds of literature, but at any rate, or other places, but at any rate, I'm hoping that we can, that I may not be able to fully characterize history. I'm not sure anybody really knows what exactly is going on in every instance, but I do want to complicate the term a little bit for us, and to make the point that the history in the Bible is much more complex than we usually give it credit for. For one thing, when we see the word history, we have certain assumptions that we bring that come from our modern understanding of what history is. And the way that typically we read history or try to understand history is that it's kind of what I like to call the dragnet version. For those of you who may remember Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. That's all we want. The facts, just the facts. But even though we say that, we also recognize that history is much, much, much more complicated, and is very much influenced by who is writing it and who they're writing it for. Okay, so if we wanted to look for something approaching a definition of history in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the word that might come closest is the word memory. Consider, for example, this verse from Deuteronomy 25. When Yahweh your God has given you rest from all your enemies on every hand in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall erase the memory of Amalek. That's a reference to a group of people from under heaven. Do not forget. So the idea is that this term of memory might suggest something about history, the history of these people of Amalek, just to erase their history, to erase their memory forever. But this has certain implications. I mean, first of all, we're talking about, and this is a large part of history, if you think of history as memory, what is remembered, and as collective memory, what comes from a group of people in the past. If you think about it, how much different memories of the past can vary. How limited they can be. For example, 1938 isn't that far in the past, and yet I doubt that there's anybody who actually remembers the broadcast among us today who actually remembers the broadcast of 1938 or remembers all the details. So we're reliant on the memory of others of the past. We also have a very literary culture. We have newspapers and magazines and writings from our past, but in ancient Israel, that was not nearly as prevalent, and many people, probably most people, couldn't read anyway. So memory gets to using that term memory begins to illustrate some of the complications of history. But if you look at this phrase as well, it suggests that the kind of memory that the biblical writer might be talking about is, in fact, a written record of some kind, an official record of some kind. It also suggests that, to some extent, this memory is created. And again, if you think about it, all of us create our memories. There have been a lot of studies of how memories are influenced by individuals. Individual memories are influenced over time. And the same thing with group memories or collective memories. So again, we're getting into the complicated nature of this. And what I want to suggest to you is that, to a large extent, the writers in the Bible are trying in some way to present a record of some sort of their past, but they're trying to do so without access to the kinds of detailed written records that we have. So they're relying largely on memory and on what I guess we could call tradition. So the objective is to explain the past without really having any detailed sources, but you're reliant on memories of others, you're reliant on other traditions, you're reliant on other kinds of literatures, including things like legends and myths. And so what we need to do is to think of this term history not as a term that excludes things like myth and legend and memories and so on, but rather as a term that in fact incorporates to some degree all of those things in an effort to provide an explanation of the past of some kind of record. Okay? And I should add that this memory, if you look at the definition from the Deuteronomy passage, is also a memory of a group of people, of a nation, or of a clan, or groups of people who want to preserve the record of their group, their nation, their ethnic group, etc. Okay, just a couple of indications of the nature of the biblical material and the fact that it is not a flawless record of the past. And then what I really want to drive home today at the end, and I'm going to allow myself time to do this, is the importance of understanding this definition of history. In other words, I think there's a big difference between trying to read the Bible as, and I don't know how to say this any other way other than in some sense to develop a caricature, but there's a big difference between reading the Bible as literal record of the past with, or precise record of what happened in the past with some effort to try to tell us how to live from here on out, as opposed to reading it in this broader sense of a history that is complicated, that incorporates all other kinds of genre. I hope that will become clear at the end what I mean by that. And the thing that I want to drive home is that the difference in reading is not just a matter of interpretation, it is absolutely crucial. It's very important and has serious implications for our day and our time. Okay, just some brief examples of the kinds of things where the Bible doesn't have exact records and sometimes gets, has things that are off, even though they're still within this realm of history. There are things that are anachronisms, that are out of time chronologically. As though you would have, if you can imagine a movie about the Civil War and somehow in the process of filming, they get a shot of one of the Union soldiers wearing a wristwatch. That would be an anachronism out of its correct historical time period. So in the book of Genesis, at the time of Abraham and Isaac, you have references to camels, you have references to the Philistines. In both cases, we know from archaeological materials that camels were not domesticated until significantly later, until about the year 1200 or so. And Philistines did not enter, the people known as Philistines did not enter the land until about that same period, which was hundreds of years after Abraham. We have the stories of Jericho and then the city, the small town of Ai that the Israelites conquer after Jericho. In both cases, these are anachronisms. Again, archaeology has shown that in fact, Jericho and Ai both were destroyed somehow or abandoned centuries before the Israelites even got there. And in the case of Ai, this is a good example of itself means ruin. So the name itself kind of incorporates the story. We have inscriptions. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of literature that the biblical writers have access to, but there is some. And when that material is available, they make use of it as though they adopt it as part of their account of the past. So, for example, we all know the story of Noah and the ark. Um, but what is not as widely known um, is where this story really comes from. And where this story comes from is it is a story that, and we have the literature to prove it. We can point to it. It is a story that is part of a Mesopotamian, that is the people from ancient Iraq, a Mesopotamian myth of creation. The idea is that the human, or that the gods create humans to do their work, and humans are doing the work of the gods. But the problem is humans are too noisy, and so the chief god decides to destroy them. And another god kind of steps in and helps to save them. And that story develops. In the Bible, that story has been lifted and borrowed and reused and retold as a way of, again, kind of associated with creation, but moving history along in some way. One of the things that you're probably familiar with, another example, is the fact that in the Bible you have people living very long lives before the flood. And so there's that, famous Bible trivia question, what's the name of the man who lived the longest? 969 years, Methuselah. You have people in the Bible before the flood who live 800-900 years. But so, again, there's this question, well, where did that come from? Did people really live long lives before the flood? But if the flood itself is part of this myth, then the answer would be no. And we know, again, where that idea came from. We have a list of kings from, again, Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer. And these kings reign 20,000 years, 30,000 years. The idea is that part of that myth that's constructed is that before the flood, people lived much longer lives. And one of the things that was a compromise after the flood is that the gods agreed, okay, well, they wouldn't destroy humans again, but human life would be limited, much more limited. Okay, we have just a third example, a story about the legend of Sargon. This dates from about 2100 BCE. And we have, and here is the legend. You can see it very briefly. This man named Sargon tells the story of his birth. And as an infant, he is placed in the river, the Euphrates, by his mother in a basket of rushes, and then conducted down and rescued. And he is raised by this man Aki, who works in the garden of the king. It's a story that explains how he came from very lowly origins to become a world leader. Okay. The story, I'm sure you recognize already, is very similar to the story of Moses' birth. And in fact, it is the source of the story of Moses' birth. So in this case, the Israelite writer, the Old Testament writer, has taken an old legend and adopted it and reused it as part of the history of Israel. All right. We have a lot of passages in the Bible that similarly to the kind of the story of that are written to explain the past in some way, to provide an explanation, or a term for this, an etiology. They're stories that explain the origin of something. Genesis 2 and 3 are full of them. Why do the animals have the names they do? Why is there this institution of marriage? Why do people wear clothes? Why do we die? Why do snakes crawl? Why do people have to work for a living? Why do women have pain in childbirth? Why do we die? And why do our bodies decompose after? And all of those things you can find some explanation of in Genesis 2 and 3. Now, the explanations are not scientific. They're not historical in the sense of things that actually happened that explain the present. But they are stories that do provide some kind of explanation of why things are the way they are today. We have, after the flood story, other etiologies. You have Noah, who plants a garden. And the reason for this is that earlier on in Genesis 5, Noah, his name means relief, or is related to the Hebrew word for relief, because he's the inventor of wine. You have the origins of professions, and Noah is the originator, the original vintner, winemaker. So he's the first to plant a vineyard. Only he gets drunk. You have this story, very sort of unseemly story about one of his sons seeing him naked, uncovered, and he wakes up and he curses that son. And you have the curse on Canaan, who is actually Noah's grandson. What does this story function as? It is an etiology for why the Israelites conquer the Canaanites and enslave the Canaanites. Okay, why they take over? It's a kind of a legitimation. You have a word play on the name Japhet, which means to enlarge. So may God enlarge, make space for Japhet. I'm going to come back to these stories in a moment, but I hope you're getting the idea of how the biblical writers have taken stories like this and used them to provide some kind of explanation. And so in chapter 10 of Genesis, we have the list, a genealogy of the sons of Noah and their descendants. But what this really is a kind of a map of how the world is repopulated following Noah's three sons after the destruction of all other humanity. And we'll come back to this map in a moment, but what I want to point out is, if you look at this, just at this little map, you have the Arabian Peninsula. You have down here, you have northern Africa and Egypt, and you have Turkey here. The point being, yes, this is the world, but it's the world as the writer knew it. Obviously, there's a lot missing here, like the rest of Africa, like most of Asia, like the Americas, like Australia, etc. That's an important point that I'll come back to in a moment. All right, I'm going to skip over this and we'll come back to it if we have time at the end. But you have, just very briefly, you have a story about God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And what that story does, frankly, is, to a large extent, it is an etiology for the area around the Dead Sea, or actually to the south of the Dead Sea, down here, where at the beginning of the story, going back to Genesis 13, Lot chooses that area to go to because it is well watered, like the garden of the Lord. But if you go there today, that's certainly not well watered. It is dry, it is desolate. And the Dead Sea is dead for a reason. The water doesn't drain from there. It evaporates. It leaves these mineral formations behind that smell like, among other things, sulfur, brimstone. And some of those even look human-like. So you have explanations in the story about why the area smells like brimstone and why it's hot, because God rained fire. Lot's wife looks like one of those pillars of salt. You have a reference to a city nearby called Zoar that means small. It's Smallville. And at the end, you have a story about the origins of the Moabites and Ammonites. It's just full of these etiologies. It is not history, per se, in terms of actual fact. All right. Let me jump to the significance of this, of all of this, of understanding that ancient history. The point is, ancient history attempts to render an account, drawing on myth, drawing on legend, drawing on other kinds of memories and traditions that were available to try to find some background to the present. Okay, but it can make use of all kinds of other types of literature just to try to explain the present. Now, of course, the closer it gets to the time of the writer, maybe the firmer, though the firmer ground those memories are on historically, those stories of the past. All right, but let me jump to why I think understanding this difference, this distinction is so important. If you go back to Genesis 2 and 3, you have the story of the creation of the woman. And in the story, God creates, first of all, in the garden, creates the man, and then God creates the garden as a place to put the man, and then God creates the animals, looking for a companion for the man, and then God creates the woman, okay, out of, the story, out of the rib of the man. If you think about that, that story is entirely backwards. And what I mean by that is men do not give birth to women. It is women who are the source of life, the ones who give life. You would expect it to be exactly the opposite. And so in a sense, the story robs from women even that power. And then as the story continues and you get into chapter 3, you have the story of the disobedience. They eat the forbidden fruit, and you come down to the end, and the man and the woman and the snake are all cursed in a way. And the snake is cursed to crawl on its belly. The man is cursed to work in the field. The woman is cursed with pain in childbirth. Okay. You can see the way that this has influenced even our language today, that expression, Eve's curse. And if you jump to 1800s, about 1869, you have the first instance of the use of anesthesia in childbirth, in the form of ether. And when that was done, there were in some theological circles objections raised. This was immoral. It was against the will of God, because God had declared the curse on woman, that she was to have pain in childbirth, and the use of anesthesia was trying to undermine this. You did not, interestingly, have similar objections when tractors were invented, despite the fact that that kind of undercuts the curse on the man in Genesis. But my point really is this. If you think about this, there's an important difference between how you read, which way you read the Genesis story. If you read it as actual fact, then you have to understand the curse on the woman as something that is the will of God declared for all eternity. And that's the way that the story is often read. And it's a reading that continues to influence our culture even today. Why is it that women across the board don't make as much as men, don't earn as much as men? Why is it that it took so long for women to get the right to vote? Why is it that we've never had a president or vice president who's a woman? Now, I know that there are all kinds of very complex social considerations behind that as well. But reading the Genesis story as literally as history, as the way things are supposed to be from there on, hasn't helped, and is part of that complex of ideas. Continuing, the curse on Ham in the Noah story. Again, dividing the world into three parts. You may know that story in Genesis 9 about Noah getting drunk and cursing Canaan, as it is in the story. But one of the things you may not be aware of, or maybe you are, is that story also continued and served for centuries as the underlying ideological explanation for slavery in the United States. And I want to show you something that is fascinating, I think, about this, and about the way that it even continues to influence readings today. And again, well, let me just look at this and then I'll make the point. So this is a quote from a textbook. This is a biological textbook, Elements of Biology. I'm not sure if it was high school or college, but notice the date, 1948. Now, that's not that long ago. That's well within the lives of our parents, at least, or grandparents of almost everybody here. And notice this is a biological textbook. It's not supposed to be fiction. It's supposed to be scientific fact. But look at the quote, "The races of man. Although modern man is classified as belonging to one species, this has been divided into three races, sometimes called stocks, namely Caucasian, Ethiopian, and Mongolian." In other words, white, black, and Asian. Now, there's absolutely no genetic or biological or scientific reason for the idea that there were three great races. It's total nonsense from a scientific perspective. Where does this idea come from? Well, from the idea of reading the Bible as literal history, and therefore Noah having three sons, and you have to trace all of human beings back to those three sons. And okay, maybe that's not so dangerous until you start reading the story in Genesis 9 as the curse on one of those sons to be slaves. And so again, this is not, again, I know there are complex factors behind this and behind the fact that people of color, and especially African Americans, are still marginalized in our society. Again, this is complex historically, complex sociologically, and so on. But once more, the Bible didn't help, or at least this reading, this misinterpretation of the Bible didn't help. Okay? The same thing with regard to the Lot story in Genesis 19. And they're reading that story again as literal history. So you have the people of Sodom. This is the origin of the term that we use, sodomite. Where did that come from? It comes from a literal reading of that story in Genesis 19 and the idea that God hates gay people. So once more, here is a misuse of this story and a misreading of this story by reading it as literal history, and a failure really to understand the genre of this literature in the Bible. All right, I've talked too much, too long. I hope you might have some questions, some comments, if there's anybody still left. And I kind of launched into preaching there, so I hope that won't be out of line. Comments, questions, objections, humorous anecdotes?
Steve, this is Rick. Of course, we all know how the Bible is used by folks as a club, and people's facts are true, are different with different people. I'm just wondering if you have had the opportunity to share this insight with folks who have a more fundamentalist view, and how that conversation transpired.
Well, I suspect all of you have had that conversation as well. Usually it doesn't go very well, as you might imagine. I think rather I'm going to cheat and not answer your question, Rick, but to say kind of on a different sort of more personal level, that's the tradition I grew out of. I mean, X number of years ago, I'd have to think how many decades it would be. I read the Bible exactly that way. Very as a very fundamentalist, literal account. And it's a very, very slow process to move out of that. I don't frankly have a simple solution, except to say that it takes a lot of work in some ways to start to learn to take the Bible on its own terms, in its own environment, in its own world. And I think part of the problem is that we want to see it as somehow speaking directly to us. And maybe it does, but that skips a lot of sources in between. It's not written in English, we forget about that. We're reading a translation. It doesn't use terms that we're familiar with. There's a lot of the Bible that is really very foreign to us, but because of the accidents of history over the centuries, it's also become very much part of our property and part of who we are. So it's a difficult tension to bridge.
As a follow-up, when you're teaching your students, and particularly those who were raised in a fundamentalist environment, and I'm sure there are many, what kind of response, shock, interaction do you have with them?
That's a really good question, Rick. And the curious thing is, over the years at Rhodes, I probably have fewer fundamentalist students today than I did, 20, 30 years ago. The number of students who are really fundamentalist, I think has declined, or at least maybe they've been warned and they just don't take my courses. But at any rate, I don't have very many fundamentalist students, but I do have a lot of students who come from mainline Christian denominations. And the curious point is that in a lot of ways, they're much less familiar with the Bible, and yet there's still that element of shock. Not to the same extent, but they're and I must say they're great kids, and they're eager to learn, and they're interested, and they don't, they're not sort of, in most cases, devastated by the shock, but it is a bit of a surprise to them. So it's a struggle, and it's a struggle I think you all share. And one I don't have any simple answers to, but it's a struggle to somehow treat the Bible as revered, as respected, as holy, as sacred, and yet to recognize that these stories are not stories, that reading them as pure history is simplistic. So is there a way that we can understand this as sacred literature and still recognize that the sacredness of it is not in the literal reading of it, that there's some other way, something else that's going on there? I'm really good at dodging the point in these questions. That's what comes of, years of practice.
In your classes, do you ever bring up the song from Porgy and Bess? It ain't necessarily so.
Yeah, not so much in. I mean, that's a great song, and not so much in these classes, mainly because most of the students have never heard that song. They're just not familiar with Porgy and Bess. It takes a while to get to that point, but it is fun to look at. In fact, there's a whole sort of subdivision of critical biblical study that has evolved over the last, say, 20 years, called reception history, in which you look at the way in which Bible stories have been reused and reinterpreted by modern media, like the Gershwin brothers, but also, I mean, I was surprised recently. A couple of colleagues and I have been working on a commentary that we recently finished on Jonah, and there's a whole bunch, I'm talking 70, 80 pieces in modern music that make use of the Jonah story, all the way from really earlier than Porgy and Bess, and all the way up to Elton John, or even more recently. Elton John and Leon Russell had a song called, what was it, Ahab, something about Ahab, that made use of the Jonah story. So there's a ton, and Elvis and everybody else in between. Lots and lots of songs about Jonah. It's a lot of fun. There's a comment on the chat. Yeah. I mean, these are all, and that's a good point too, Kathy. Thank you for that. What most of what I'm saying is not really all that new. I mean, this has been around for decades. It's part, I think, of the kind of fear, the anti-intellectual fear in our society in general.
Ed, we can't hear you. You're on mute. No, still on mute. Hang on. I can maybe unmute you.
Did that do it?
Yes.
I was thinking back, thinking about Dr. McKenzie's classes, and I was at SMU and had a Quaker professor, and we were reading about the temptation. It was The Life and Teachings of Jesus was the name of the course, and we were talking about Jesus and the temptations. And Dr. Carroll said, well, Mr. Beasley, what do you think the devil looked like? And I was really puzzled, and I didn't have an answer. He said, well, I suppose he was red and had a pitchfork, don't you think? And to me, it was that humor that it was a really great way to get me to start rethinking the way I thought about the Bible, because I was very literal in my interpretation of it. And I've never been the same since. You know, it's been a great freedom to get out of that box.
Hey, thank you for that. And I would say, in some ways, going back to Rick's question, that I think you all, to a large extent, are really the heroes in all of this. I mean, you've been through this. You probably haven't had the all that much success with in conversations, or maybe you have with people who are much more literalistic in their reading. But you've all, I think, probably been through that, and I think we could learn a lot from you and your experiences. You should come to my classes and teach. I suspect that I know the students have a lot that they could learn from you.
Yeah, I grew up in that sort of very conservative milieu, how you say that. Ed, my cousin, and I grew up at Second Pres, and it was a very literal interpretation. And my mother, who went to Rhodes or Southwestern for a couple of years, I remember her saying in sort of a horrified voice, "Oh, over there, they're teaching you it's not to be taken literally." So this would have been in the 50s or 60s, I guess, that I heard this comment. So I'm really grateful to have found ways that I can come away from that. I've always been grateful for that, and take these things in a way that speaks to me of God's love and God's goodness, and not so much these little rules about stuff. So, anyway.
I can remember we had a thing called junior church at Second, and instead of going to worship at 11, if you were in the junior high and younger, you went to junior church. And Phil Esty, the minister, he was a big guy, and he had a booming voice. And after we had stood up and said the books of the Bible as fast as we could, and you had to sit down if you missed it, he would say, "Well, let's see what God says." And then he would read the scripture, and it was, I mean, he was God, and God was speaking those specific words. And it was terrifying because they were judgmental and so restrictive. And, you know, it was just like breaking out of jail to leave Second Presbyterian.
Do you think that's changed nowadays? Or is it still the same over there?
I don't know. I went to the Come to Jesus meeting that they had with Independent and Second, and about Steve Haynes's book. What's the name of it? The Most Segregated Hour. Is that the name of it? And a lot of my contemporaries who I went to Sunday school with, a number of them were still there, and some of them were still saying, well, it was all taken out of context and things, you know, things like that. And it was, you know, the elders just stood hands and kept the students from Rhodes and Lemoyne from coming in the church because they were there to demonstrate. And, you know, my father always said, well, what about the guy who's there trying just to sell life insurance? you know, we didn't keep him out of the church. But I don't know. There's been some change for sure, but Idlewild is still seen, I think, as being very to the left and confusing to my friends at Second. What do you think, Minna?
I think so. My brother and his family are still there. I think it's important for those people with that kind of belief to think in the afterlife. If I don't grasp these truths that are traditional to the church, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I think God is good and loves us, and whatever comes next is going to be the best that can come next. I don't know what that is. Maybe we just sleep. I mean, I don't know, but I think that's horrifying to the people at Second, that there's not a lot of really set rules about how you get to salvation. I can't speak for all of them. Yeah, so I don't know.
Now, next week, Dr. McKenzie, are we going to cover the oceans boiling and the other apocalypse stuff?
In a manner of speaking, yeah. We'll talk about the genre of apocalyptic, yeah, and what that literature really represents, what it's really about, and its kind of roots. Yeah, and it may or may not surprise you to know that it really doesn't have much to do with the end of the world. Sort of a little bit, but that's not really the main point.
Thank you for today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We're at time, so you have 12 minutes to get ready for church. Fortunately, it's not too far away. It's the same computer. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you guys next week.
All right.
Thank you. Great.